Good afternoon. It is an afternoon. It is Tuesday. It is May 10th, and this is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's weekly meeting. We had to move it up a day for various reasons. We have a very slight agenda, but before we get to that, let's take a pulse of our existence with the roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Misner.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 5 out of 7 commissioners present.
Fantastic. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Again, I said we had a slight agenda. We've got a few items to consider. The first is commissioner comments. Does any commissioner have comments for the good of the cause? Okay, I've got maybe 1.5 comments. The half of a comment is the enterprise legislation continues to work through the Colorado legislature. It is as we anticipated, and we're hopeful that it will be approved. At least that's one commissioner's perspective. The second is that I will be attending the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission business meeting this weekend. I'm going to be appearing remotely. I had some scheduling conflicts, but I will be appearing at that. And I did want to let my fellow commissioners know that I sought and was granted by the Oklahoma governor a position on the resolutions committee, which is an important committee that helps define policy or establish resolutions that go out to the US government, the Canadian government, and others and states. So I will be serving a 3-year stint on the resolutions committee, and I would definitely plan on bringing thoughts back to the commission, as well as thoughts to the administration, so that we can make sure that Colorado's voice is heard correctly. So there's that. So those are my commissioner comments for the day. Seeing no other commissioner comments, we did not have any general public comment sign up. We did have one written public comment, and that came from Kate Christensen. We appreciate Ms. Christensen's comment, which we have read. Next on the agenda is the consent agenda. Does anybody have any questions with regard to consent? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve consent?
So moved. Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second on consent. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of consent agenda signify by saying aye.
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 Great. Moving quickly through our agenda today, the last part of our agenda is, quote, commissioner feedback on staff's cumulative impacts report. So I think this is an opportunity for commissioners to provide feedback to the world at large, to ourselves, to Director Murphy, who just floated into the hearing. Good to see you. To provide feedback on the report that was generated earlier this year. Does anyone have feedback, or does anyone want to go first? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that do we also have on the agenda then from Director Murphy a discussion about emissions from Orphan Wells? Is that later?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm discombobulated, so just want to make sure that's on there.
That's later.
Okay.
I think I'm looking at the agenda that remains posted. And I know you had asked for that to be on the agenda, so we can certainly take that up. Thank you for the.
Perfect. I do have some comments. If you give me a second, I'm going to just pull up my notes or just some thoughts. And sorry, multitasking. I think I have three big comments and then 2 minor comments. And the 3 big comments are not to be solved today, but I feel like that have been kind of top of mind for me when we look at cumulative impacts. And then while I read through the report, realized that at some point, I think we should perhaps try to tackle what exactly is the geographic footprint for cumulative impacts. And so as we've been looking at OGDPs individually, I think we've heard some feedback from folks, or even I as a commissioner, I'm trying to figure out how big of a footprint do I look at when we're talking about cumulative impacts? Where does that boundary hit? And I don't have an answer, but I think it's a discussion for somewhere down the line. The second for me is kind of the breadth of the cumulative impacts. We've had some testimony from operators about, is electrification good or bad? Because if the electricity comes from a coal-fired power plant, what is that cumulative impact? And I guess I'm not ready to go that far upstream. And for that matter, I'm not ready to go as far downstream as some of our other folks who have talked to us about cumulative impacts, wanting to have us all also consider like where the product gets used. And so food for thought is kind of, you know, how far upstream or downstream do we look at when we're looking at cumulative impacts over this long term? And then finally, from a big 5,000 foot level, you know, the total impact of oil and gas operations in a defined area. Some of our stakeholders have been asking us to look at things in addition to what is happening, in addition to the oil and gas development, which is like, are there highways nearby or other industrial activities? And my thought at this time is that that's kind of beyond our ability to model or to look at. And our job is to figure out what the cumulative impacts are for oil and gas. But I think it's something we should consider for discussion sometime in the future. From a detailed perspective, I was wondering if staff had any thoughts about whether or not the CITER database is, I know we just started, but is it collecting the right data? When will we know if it's really working the way it should? And how will we be using some of those data points, for example, estimated emissions versus actual emissions at some point? When I was reviewing the plan, sorry, I'm just going through my list and people can tell me what they think. It was pretty clear to me that the DJ Basin is not using a lot of recycled water, but I also understand that we don't have very many data points at this point in time. Was wondering if there was usefulness to having a discussion with operators about whether or not there were barriers to using recycled water in the DJ Basin. And then obviously something that I've been thinking about a lot too is how will we know over time if the total emissions from methane or VOCs or HAPs are increasing or decreasing in total, not just for the small amount of OGDPs that we're looking at compared to some sort of a baseline. So those were my thoughts.
Very good. I appreciate all those thoughts. You have done a good job of thinking through those issues and providing the feedback to us. I think that's great. I know that I'm taking notes. I know you've got your notes. I think what might be helpful, Commissioner McGowan, is if we can all sort of collectively create a doc where we can put all of these thoughts, maybe a Google Doc that we can share. And that way we can edit and we can create a living doc that we can continue to share with staff and others. I would note for the record that Director Murphy had to hop off real quick for a legislative matter. So that's another reason that us creating a Google Doc with our thoughts would be helpful, so that we can keep it up as a living document, but also have feedback with staff about it. So thank you for starting off with really great critical comments there, Commissioner McGowan. Others? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner McGowan. I think that you've hit a lot of the things that I've got in my notes. And I think, like you indicated, these are things that I'm chewing on, trying to figure out, how to incorporate these or bringing ideas up just for general discussion to put in perhaps a Google Doc like Chairman Robbins has indicated. And I think the geographic area you talk about as far as looking at cumulative impacts, I think is a good one. I'm thinking of it the term that I use is carrying capacity, right? And whether that's a carrying capacity for potential impacts to wildlife on the Western Slope, or is that a carrying capacity for certain emissions associated with oil and gas activities, in the DJ Basin? But is there a way to evaluate carrying capacity, or how does this information feed into a concept of carrying capacity, or not, right? And but this is often something, at least in my previous life and land use stuff, that gets talked about with subdivisions and housing and water use and carrying capacity of certain areas, and kind of water, sewer, infrastructure stuff. So that's kind of something that has been kicking around in my mind. We have received some comments around the cumulative impacts report, and whether or not, I guess, how we use that report, how we use the information that's being provided to define cumulative impacts, but also how do we ultimately use it to address cumulative impacts. And I think that there is some analysis and discussion within the cumulative impacts report that talks about the utilization of comprehensive area plans and other mechanisms, even within the review of OGDPs, that employ certain technologies in order to minimize or mitigate certain cumulative impacts. But how do we look at that or utilize the data to look at cumulative impacts in kind of a bigger picture carrying capacity type of analysis, to just generally understand what are the overall impacts of the things that we are permitting on a particular receptor in an area. And so, I think this is a good step forward in defining the different pieces. And at some point, I think that discussion of what kind of reporting or analysis is going to be utilized to address cumulative impacts and ensure that this information that we're collecting and reporting on feeds into that kind of bigger picture is things that I've been kicking around a little bit. I think that there's still a work in progress as far as defining the roles between AQCC, APCD, and COGCC as far as how we're addressing cumulative impacts in particular. And I know that CDPHE has certain requirements under certain pieces of legislation to address certain elements of cumulative impacts. How does that work together with some of the things that we're looking at in our permitting process, or does it need to? So now you've got a little taste into what goes on in my brain when I start thinking about this stuff, because this is a really difficult topic, and I don't know as I have any answers, but these are the things that I continue to chew on when I'm thinking about cumulative impacts.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Appreciate all those comments. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So I think the report is a really great framework for us to start with, right? I think that it really captures the myriad of things that we're looking at when we're receiving and then subsequently analyzing cumulative impacts data. And so I think it's a great starting place. 7 OGDPs is all that we had to base that report on. And I'm really looking forward to how that information continues to come in from operators throughout this year, 2022. Hopefully we can populate more of that, and then start looking at how we can take the information that is anticipated and estimated through the Form 2Bs and apply it to actuals, right, that are coming out of these OGDPs. So that's kind of what I think is one of the future steps for this report. In reading through it, I was thinking back to the 7 OGDPs that we had in 2021 and the different operations that those cover, right? We had helium wells down, in the southern and southeastern part of the state. And then we had, western slope vertical wells. We had DJ horizontal wells. And I'm curious if there's any benefit in looking at, and I guess breaking out the data in ways that are operation specific, more so than just region specific. And I think that we'll find a lot of commonalities in regards to which operations are in the different regions of the states that may not be, either super difficult or on the other hand, super beneficial, but it's something that I was noodling as I was reading through the report again in preparation for this meeting. So, that's something that I was thinking about in how we look at it. I think that for me, questions beget more questions, right? And I am reading through it and I'm thinking, okay, what's next, and how are we going to analyze this data? And I think that we will continue to learn as we work our way through it, as we see more OGDPs, we see more Form 2Bs come before us, and that hopefully in an evergreen fashion will help guide what these subsequent reports look like year after year. So that's kind of my comments on the report. I appreciate all the work that went into it, the thoroughness, and again, I think it's a really great framework to start us off with this inaugural report. And I anticipate it will be fleshed out substantially here as more years come and go.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. I agree with all three of my fellow commissioners. It seems like we're on a path to building a good database of information. I think we should stay the course and elevate the course. One point that I'm excited to see is we've got multiple comprehensive area plans percolating through the system, and I think that will do a good job of helping to further define information in the database and give us opportunities to define some of the, or put some parameters around some of the things that you brought up, Commissioner McGowan, about, what is the footprint, what is the database, what is the breadth and depth of what we're trying to do. So with those concluding comments from commissioners, I would want to recognize Director Murphy to see if she had any comments back at us or back with us on cumulative impacts and the discussion.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, commissioners, for your thoughts. I think those are all pieces that are kind of working through the system. To me, Ms. Bartlett, when she first introduced this topic to us a couple of months ago, started with the idea that we're building the framework, right? And year one is going to be a limited set of data. And year two, you start to build more. And then year three, you start to understand what it looks like. But, and so I think that, we need to let that process play forward. And I think that's consistent with all of your comments today. But making sure that we had the conversation today was critically important to me, to make sure we create the institutional memory of having these check-in conversations at a time early enough in the calendar year that we can start to adjust or accommodate in the report that's actually due in December. So in terms of, I just wanted to acknowledge the process change that we're trying to implement today, even if we don't have major substantive changes to what's actually being performed. And so hopefully, we can, when all of us have retired, somebody else will be remembered to carry forward this conversation.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Anything further from commissioners on this topic? Commissioner McGowan, I'm going to volunteer you to possibly start on the Google Doc, since you had the most specific comments, and then the rest of us can flesh into it with our ideas. Director Murphy, while you were away, we came up with the idea that since you had to miss a little bit of it, we would put all of our thoughts in a Google Doc and make that available to you and staff and to commissioners, so that we've got an evergreen document that can continue to move forward on this topic.
Wonderful, thank you.
And thank you for nodding up and down, Commissioner McGowan, to do that. We appreciate it. Okay, moving on. Now that I have the correct agenda, I apologize for that. We did have a item entitled Staff Request for Monies to be spent from the Martinez-Irwin Fund to support Colorado State University's collection of emissions data at Orphan Well locations. Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And I will quickly hand this over to Commissioner McGowan, who I've been working with closely on this initiative for quite a few months. The big picture piece is that as stakeholder conversations unfolded around financial assurance, lots of questions and concerns were raised around emissions from idle, plugged, or recently plugged wells. And in response to that, we had our then Assistant Attorney General Minor, he's now working with the Department of Public Health and Environment, put together kind of a literature review of what we know about methane emissions in particular from either idle or plugged wells. And I think that that lit review is still a really wonderful source of information, but it didn't have anything that was specific to Colorado. And so working with Commissioner McGowan, we reached out to a couple of different entities that might be able to help support an initial look at Colorado specific methane emissions from wells. We've focused entirely on kind of the orphan wells because we have a lot of kind of control and access to those sites to get an initial picture. And so we have worked closely with Colorado State University, who has done this type of work for other entities and kind of across the nation to put together a proposal. And with that, I think I would turn it over to Commissioner McGowan to flesh out a little bit more about it. But that's the background and framework, and the big picture goal is to use these funds to better understand emissions from orphaned infrastructure, which I think is in line with the goals and purpose of the fund as well. With that, Commissioner McGowan, I'm actually going to turn it over to you.
Okay, I think that was a nice, really big picture summary. So I took some notes just to flesh things out a little bit for commissioners. What we've been talking about with CSU is 3 parts to the project. 1, which is the literature review that Director Murphy talked about. 2 is the field study. So they would actually be going out and testing and looking for emissions from 3 different kinds of wells. They're defining those as, 1 is marginal, and those are the scope is orphan wells that are in our orphan well program. So we'll be able to have fairly easy access for the researchers. When you look at the map of where the orphan wells are, there's actually a pretty good geographic spread. And so I think we'll have a good kind of diversity of wells to be able to review and test. But the 3 types of wells that will be tested are what they're calling marginal, less than 1 BOE a day. So they've been orphaned, but they still haven't been plugged and very low producing. The other is orphaned but non-producing. And then the 3rd category would be those that are P&A'd. The work would be done this summer. They would be testing about 320 wells. They would resample up to 20% of those wells in the winter under different environmental conditions, because emissions can be affected by the weather and temperature, apparently. I learned a lot, or some, through this discussions with CSU. They've done some of this work already with the Department of Interior. And so I feel like they kind of know what to look for and how to put the data together. The final piece is they will write a report for the commission that will be shared with the commission and presented. And if so desired, they would be allowed to publish their findings, and it would just add to the literature review for other folks who are looking at emissions from orphan wells. And then Director Murphy, I'm not sure, I'm hoping that I'm understanding also that we perhaps believe that some of our federal funds that can be and should be used to plug orphan wells will also be eligible for continued emissions work and study, and perhaps even DOE, the Department of Interior, will want us to do this. And so this is a good way for us to kick off our data and looking at emissions, and then any kind of future work and use of our federal funds. So I hope I have that right. If I don't, please correct me.
Because I can't help myself, I'll jump in and talk about it, but I think you have it right, Commissioner McGowan. And the context is that as part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act that provides federal funding for orphan well work throughout the nation, the federal government, when expending its fund, is required to look at methane emissions. States, it is not required for states to do this, but it happens to dovetail with what I have been working on with Commissioner McGowan and Colorado State University. The 2 projects dovetail. We have asked Colorado State University to make sure that their methodology dovetails with what Department of Interior is expecting the federal government to collect and the states to collect when performing the plugging work. And so it's a nice synergy of opportunities and aligning of interests. And so for year 1, yes, our intent is to use Martinez-Irwin funds to get a feel for that. And then we can start building into our budget the expectation that this work is performed by a contractor or contractors moving forward using the federal funds.
Excellent. Thank you both for the presentation, and thank you for your good work. Go ahead, Commissioner McGowan.
Sorry, thank you. And I think the total cost for the whole project is anywhere between $240,000 and $260,000 for the whole project.
Commissioner McGowan, then are you looking for a motion from commissioners to so approve said utilization of said funds?
Is it a motion, Director Murphy, or do we just kind of give you a green light and a thumbs up? I'm not sure how that works. So
Look at how your AAG just appeared magically.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Yes, motion.
So I would like to move that we use some of the Erwin Martinez funds to contract with CSU to do a literature review around emissions for Orphan Wells, a field study, and a final report.
We have
Second.
a motion and we have a second. Is there further discussion around the motion? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for putting together what sounds like a really good project. I'm fully in support of the project. I think this is important information to continue to collect. I do have just kind of a general comment about the fund in general. I think at one point we had talked about perhaps doing a little strategic planning around kind of overall utilization of the fund and how the different projects that are being considered in the fund tie together towards a strategic mission. And I guess I'm kind of curious where that's at, and whether that's something that still anticipates. It has nothing necessarily to do with this project, because I think this is a valuable project and it makes sense, but I don't know, the structure guy in my brain wants to see it all tie together towards a more comprehensive goal. So
I recall that discussion as well. I also don't recall anybody picking up that ball and running with it. Director Murphy, did you have comments on this?
That was probably a blunter way of what I was going to say, which is I don't think that we've taken great strides in providing a big picture vision for the fund. We've been working through different opportunities and trying to work with CDPHE in the midst of kind of looking at a number of legislative priorities and everything else. But I think that is something that certainly could occur. Some of the work that we've contracted with Sure Environmental and Ms. Bartlett, I think falls into that category of kind of bigger picture thinking and scoping. And as a preview, and I probably will not be, I'll probably be on parental leave for this portion of it, but I think that there will be another ask coming to the commission to talk about some of the things even that you all have talked about today. And I'm thinking back specifically to Commissioner Gonzalez's comments around emissions, cumulative impacts, and trying to dial those pieces in. So I think that's something we might need to double back on, Commissioner Messner. That was a really long answer to a fairly short question.
And Commissioner McGowan?
I'm happy to take a crack at getting some sort of a framework for us having a discussion about strategic planning, and then passing it by the commissioners and seeing if there's some sort of a process that we all agree to that makes sense for us. If you all want me to try to kick that off, Commissioner Messner. Because I agree with you. I think it's important for us to have some sort of a bigger picture in mind and make sure that we're using the funds thoughtfully and to head in the right direction
And
strategically.
So I think that's fine. And I, as one commissioner, will take you up on that. I think that, the other component is we could probably ask Scott Cuthbertson, our deputy director, to send around sort of the Google Doc that shows all the usage of the funds to date, so that we can get that perspective as well. And then we could, have a discussion at a future meeting about this very topic, Commissioner Messner, if that's comfortable to you.
yeah, I think that's all great. And I'm also happy to participate or help out however I can. My intent is not to burden staff with additional projects, but do think that this is important to have some structure to this. So,
Well, if you want to reach out to Scott, Commissioner Messner, and get that information and put it into some format that is, shareable. Once again, we're doing lots of that today. That can take something off of his desk, and you can work on that. And Commissioner McGowan, you can take the strategic part and go ahead.
I think in addition to how the funds has been spent to date, would be to Director Murphy's point, a reminder of the 4 buckets that we are having Ms. Bartlett work on, that we are funding with Erwin Martinez, and maybe a dive into that, because I think those 4 buckets strategically are a commitment by us, of course, because we're having her work on data, cumulative impacts, health health, those big four buckets. And so might be a good idea for us to review that as well and see what aligns with that work and what we think is going to happen in the future.
All right, I think we've got a motion and a second to approve the use of the funds for the project as mentioned. We've had some discussion. Is there any further discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Direction given. That concludes the first agenda and the second agenda that I received. I do not believe we have anything else on our agenda today. Does anybody else have anything for the good of the cause? All right, seeing none, I think we're looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor to adjourn signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. See you later, folks.